Without any further ado, let's get down to business. We're in the winter series of 2018 to 2019 entitled Democracy, Peace, and Its Discontents, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the second half of the 1970s. Tonight's the 11th lecture, 11 out of 19, called Israel and the Arabs in the late 1970s. So without further ado, here we go. The 1970s, which is what we've been looking at, the second half particularly, now I'm looking from the Arab perspective, was the last real decade of what we call classic Arab nationalism. This doesn't exist anymore. I'm talking about Arab nationalism with capital letters, A-N. The kind of thing that was big once upon a time when Nasser was running around was big. It's not there anymore, so it's an episode. Arab nationalism, which swept the Middle East once upon a time, had several characteristics. First of all, this is a movement that was secular, or at least as secular as you can get in the Middle East. The Middle East is not Europe. In Europe, you can be atheist, and they are. In America, you can push for atheism, and they do. And it doesn't work in the Middle East. They're in a different place culturally and historically, and therefore anything that was momish, secular, with no religious content whatsoever, wouldn't fly. But by the standards of the Middle East, it was as secular as you could get. Right? And that's what Arab nationalism was once upon a time. And so when all the passion was poured into that, you didn't have the Taliban and the other kind of things that we have today. Second of all, Arab nationalism was based, as all nationalism is based, on a certain mythology. All nationalism is based on this. And that's the notion, as I said many times, that there's like a hypostasis called a nation. In other words, the USA is not composed of 350 million individuals, which it is. And scientifically, that's all you can say. There's 350 million human beings over here. Some are like this and some are like that. But beyond that, if you're a nationalist, you posit that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And there's a thing called America. And America, you can't do this. And America doesn't feel that way. A lot of the fights currently in the politics, pro and against Trump, is this. Trump said, this is American. They said, no, it's anti-American. These are all fighting over mythological factors. So it's very important in history. And if you're talking about the Middle East, Arab nationalism posits or, stipulates there's something called the Arab nation. So even though really you got your Moroccans over here, your Libyans over there, your Yemenites over here, your Abu Dhabi stuff over here, your Iraqi this, and the Kurds on. No. It's all Arab. It's one nation. You see? Now, either you buy into that or you don't. But if you're an Arab nationalist, as this movement arose in the 20th century, that's what you tie in. A corollary of this goes as follows. If there is indeed a single Arab nation, why doesn't the map look like that? Right? It should be, this is a country. This should be, right, to an Arab nationalist, this should be a single state. Why is it not? Okay? Now, the answer, of course, is the Arabs as a people were messed over by the European imperialists. That's the argument. Okay? This is part of the basic ideology, mythology, whatever you want to call it, of Arab nationalism. Really, we're one country, but we were messed up by these type of people. Here's Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War II when they tried the borders. Here is the British at the Cairo conference under Churchill in 1922 when they decided, remember this? There used to be one Palestine. He said, nah, the heck with it. Let's make Jordan in Palestine. They just decided to do it. So they rewrote the map. Yes, I know it's Transjordan. I get it. Math and science is the bane of my existence. Anyway, and they decided, and also, by the way, Iraq. The lady over there is Gertrude Bell. She's the one who made Iraq. Now, anyhow, the bottom line is these evil European imperialists messed over the pristine and pure, united Arab nation. And we're suffering the consequences of that. Now, the truth of the matter is, of course, this is quite hypocritical because the Arabs are the biggest imperialists. Okay? Where did the Arab Empire come from? They busted in the 7th century out of Arabia and conquered by the sword this great empire. So, for them to say, oh my goodness, you're taking over other countries and creating a great empire, is the pot calling the kettle black. But it doesn't matter. Let's get this straight. When the Arabs in the 7th century and the 8th century conquered all these territories, they destroyed, not immediately, but pretty rapidly, many existing non-Arab countries. You've heard of a country called Egypt. You know, as I always point out, there was an Egypt before Abraham. they had the pyramids and the hieroglyphics and all that business, a big culture, once upon a time. No, they don't. And now it's all Arabic. That's the argument. You see? Same thing with Iraq, if you want to get down to it. There was Babylonia and Sumeria and so forth long ago, and Persia and many other places. And what happened to the existing cultures? Well, they're pushed aside. Okay? They're pushed aside. Matter of fact, if you go to Spain and some of these countries, you can see places that once upon a time were a church and then were changed into a mosque. And then in Spain, they were changed back into a church. So you can see three layers. So there is a lot of imperialism going on in the Arab history. But nevertheless, put that aside. And finally, or not finally, but importantly, Arab nationalism has as an important component a sense of victimization. Right? The others did it to us. Matter of fact, it's the theory, this is basic to Arab nationalism. All the problems in the Arab world are the fault of others. I get it, and I get the argument. I'm not too healthy. We have plenty of groups like that in America as well. If you go through life always blaming what happened to you on others, chances are you're not going to get ahead. That's what my experience has taught me. Now, finally, Israel and Zionism are located entirely or almost entirely within that context, if you're an Arab nationalist. Israel and Zionism. Israel was nothing but a bastion of imperialism, and European imperialism, carried to new heights or new depths by the systematic physical removal of the indigenous Arab population in 1947, 48, and 49. That is the basic argument of Arab nationalism. Now this is, let me get this straight. The Jews have no culture. The Jews have no real nationhood. This is baloney. The Jews are always were content to live a minority existence as long as they're allowed to practice their own little religion in their own conclaves. For want of a better term, I'll say mea charms. And why is it that Herzl and others at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, created this movement of nationalism? It's part of appealing to Europe to say, give us a fortress, a base in Europe within Arab territory. We'll make a European country, and that'll be an outpost or a colony of Europe within the Arab territory. I keep using the word imperial, colony, and all the rest, meaning you're a foreign group within an Arab territory. And therefore, that's all you are. And therefore, just like we're going to kick everybody else out, the British, the French, the Italians, the others are also going to kick at the Jews who are nothing but the servants of the British, French, the Italians. Except that when it's Zionism, it's worse. Because in the other territories, they didn't get rid of the locals, and therefore you had Arabs all over the place, and consequently, little by little, the local population was able to kick out the colonialists. For example, the British ruled India, Egypt. But Egypt was full of Egyptians. Eventually, that didn't work, so they threw the British out. Algeria was full of Algerians, of Arabs. They had French there too, but they're full of Arabs, and they're all over the place. Eventually, the local population spit them out. The Zionists are so sneaky that they kicked the Arabs out. Right? This was the deliberate policy, they said, in 47, 40, 49. And by doing that, they created all Jewish zones. And then it's hard to say the local Arabs are going to kick you out. Because by the time the 48, 49 war was over, there were only 150, 175,000 Arabs in the whole state of Israel. I'm talking about the old Israel, before 67. And that's not large enough to make an indigenous movement to throw them out. So Zionism, there are books on this. When I was in the 60s, whole treatises. The Zionism represents the most advanced stage, or the most negative stage, of colonialism and imperialism. I sound like a professor at Hopkins. 1965. No, 1965. Get it? This was the parlance. And that's how you believe. Now, as I said before, this is really a very racist kind of view, because what it means is really is like the Jews have no real culture of their own, no real national aspirations of their own. Jews are not entitled to an area of their own. The Jews are just like that, junk. And they got a chutzpah coming to trying to set something up, a state of their own, and that can only be understood as being part of a European imperialist scheme. It can't be an indigenous business. Because after the Jews were around for hundreds and hundreds of years and never made a move like this. So it must be something new and sneaky and sinister. That's how you looked at it once upon a time. Now, according to this school of thought, the Arab world represented a unity that had been artificially pulled apart so that the imperialists could rule each piece more easily, usually through these questlings. So if you're an Arab nationalist, you say, who's King Farouk of Egypt? Well, he's set up by the British. He's a phony. What's King Abdullah of Jordan? Trans-Jordan. So you say, what's all that about? Oh, he's a puppet set up by the British. It's baloney. Right? They just made him artificially. As Winston Churchill said, I created Jordan over whiskey and a soda in a hotel room in Cairo in the summer of 1922. There's truth to that. But then what you said is the whole Jordan has no Metzius, no legitimacy. It represents just an imperialist business. And same thing with the other countries. Iraq, by the way, was done the same way. The British just created this, country called ABC. This group in the south, this group in the middle, this group in the top, the Kurds, and we call it a country, and we put one of our guys, King Faisal, in there. So all these rulers really represent quislings. They're traitors to the Arab cause because they're setting up shop in their own country and trying to rule their own area separate from any other country. And really, they're not separate from any other country. They should be saying we're dropping our own national identity and amalgamating one large Arab state. So that's how the Arab nationalists view it. Now, the struggle for Arab nationalism was a two-stage struggle. This is the way they see it. Number one, A, you want each Arab state to kick out the European imperialists from its national territory. So eventually, the Egyptians kicked the British out of Egypt. The Syrians kicked the French out of Syria eventually. The Iraqis kicked the British out of Iraq, and so on and so forth. The French got kicked out of Algeria and Morocco, as we know. And that's stage one. And then stage two is, then all these separate states, which really should not be separate, will now amalgamate, will unite into one large Arab state. And then you'll have Mashiach side. Now, part of the struggle, therefore, to kick out the imperialists is a struggle to put an end to the state of Israel and liberate the Palestinians. That's how if you're an Arab nationalist, that's how you locate the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not a religious thing so much. It's not that Jews are sneaky or something like that. It's just part of the grand scheme. Just like the French are being kicked out by the Algerians and those groups, and this one's being kicked out over here, and they're kicking them out of South Yemen, the Jews are going to be kicked out of Israel. Because the Jews in this scheme are equal to the British, the French, the Italians, and all that kind of thing. Right? And as I told you before, it's an extremely racist kind of a way of looking at Israel. And the Israelis from day one, obviously said, no, we're different. This is not a crusader state, as you call it. This is not some foreign plant. We actually live here. But the Arabs don't want to hear any of that. Once the imperialist states have been kicked out, the liberated states would then unite into a vast secular, more or less secular, Arab state. And then the Arabs would be really powerful. Because if you had a country as big as the map I just showed you, it's one of the big players in the world. And maybe the biggest in their scheme, right? One day. If this was a single country, by the way, with the oil and the population, you hear the VART. Potentially, I'll say it again, potentially it could be a mega power. You understand? Potentially. Now, I'm of course putting aside the fact that they don't have a big educational base and that sort of thing, but the money is there and the potential is there. And that would be the Mashiach time as they see it over there. Now, this is the basic vision of Arab nationalism. As I've said here many times in the past, it was articulated most powerful by Nasser. And in the 1950s and early 60s, his vision captured the imagination of the young. Okay? So, this is Gaddafi, this is Saddam Hussein. How did they become who they were? When the young kids, they were growing up and hearing all the ideas I just told you, they say, yeah, I really buy into this. Therefore, they overthrew the governments in the countries that they lived in, and they set up Arab nationalists. They set up their own dictatorships, and then they said to Nasser, Gaddafi certainly did, said to Nasser, let's join in one big country. Now, Saddam Hussein came into power later, after Nasser fell, but in the early days he ran away, was hiding by Nasser for a while. If these guys would have their way, then once this guy took over this country, and that guy took over that country, that guy took over that country, they really said, we'll go to Nasser in the 60s, and we'll make one very big country, and we'll carry out the dream. We can do it, because I control Libya now, so I can make happen whatever I want, and you control Iraq, and this one controls this country and that country. That was the general idea. Okay? This is what Israel had to live with once upon a time. So powerful was the ideology that in the late 1950s, Syria voluntarily joined Egypt in one country. We've talked about it in the past. They're what they call the United Arab Republic, which means the Syrians, think about what I'm saying. The Syrians gave up their sovereignty, and they said in 58 or 59, Nasser, you come and be the president of Syria as well as of Egypt. We'll call it the United Arab Republic. They expected that it'll work out well and that Nasser will run Egypt through Egyptians and that Nasser will run Syria through Syrians. It didn't quite work out, but that's the idea. And then you have a powerful state. And if they have one set of laws and this and the other, they've taken a big step towards the achievement of the grand goal. Okay, so they have. In 1960, if you were Ben Gurion, let's say, living in 1960, this vision seemed gripping and unstoppable. But the 1960s were funny. During that decade, the vision ran into reality. Number one, the conservative countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Morocco, they did not succumb. They said, we don't want to give up our individual powers as kings and rulers of our own country, and we're not giving in to Nasser, and they fought him very bitterly. If there was any Nasserites in their country, they did their best to kill him or suppress him, and they did a pretty effective job. That's number one. Number two, the amalgamation process into a single state was harder to execute in reality than it was in theory, even among countries who desired it. So what Lamaisa happened to this when Egypt and Syria joined together in one country? After 2-3 years, they got a get. You understand? The Syrians threw them out because they said, no, you're trying to run Syria through Egyptians. We don't want to do that. We don't want to be a colony of Egypt. We want to be part of the United States. You be New York, we'll be Pennsylvania. That's a different story. But if this is really a scheme that you want to run our country, then we don't want to be part of that. And Nasser was not a George Washington or a figure like that. At the end of the day, it's a big talk. When you put it into practice, it's very hard. If you know anything, and we do, about American politics and American history, a lot of negotiations and jawboning goes on anytime anything's supposed to happen in politics. And that's been true since 1776. It wasn't easy to put together the 13 states in a single country. It wasn't easy to add the new states. You had amendments and amendments and this and that and the other. A lot of horse trading. And that's how you call getting people from different states to run one country. It can't be that one group runs everybody else. You see? Again, that's like a big, it seems to me that's a big factor of the, what should I say, the polarizing American politics today. It seems to a lot of people that few people want to run the country. Or if you're on the left, it seems a few right-wingers want to run the country. If you're on the right, it seems a few left-wingers want to run the country. And that's what causes, I think, all the toxic, things that we hear all the time in the American political culture that we didn't used to hear so long ago. Anyway, but this is what happened. Now, that fell apart, but the dream lived on. Even in the 1970s, Gaddafi was a stickle nut. And I'll say it again. He was nuts. Gaddafi, but he was a Talmud. He really was a Talmud in theory of Nasser. And he bought into what I just told you, hook, line, sinker. And after Nasser died, he was still the head of Libya. And he said in the 70s that we should unite in a single country. Egypt had various schemes, but it's always Libya, Egypt, and Sudan, or maybe Syria, something like that. And by that time, in reality, the Arab nationalism was fading. And they basically said, we don't want a country together with Gaddafi. But the aura of Arab nationalism was so popular, you couldn't go against it. So they sign anything. Here's who is this? Assad and Sadat and Gaddafi signing, we promise to unite into one single country. But it's not worth the paper it's written on. You see, in other words, by the 1970s, you have the externals, but not the internal, not the really deeply held feelings about all this anymore. And finally, I would say the shock of the shock of the Six-Day War, when Israel defeated three well-equipped Arab armies. That's not how history was supposed to proceed. If you're Arab nationalists, you see a progressive narrative. There was, before World War II, and all these countries were ruled by the Europeans. And then after World War II comes the founding of the Arab League. And then little by little, they throw the French out of Syria and Lebanon in the 40s. They throw the British out of Egypt in the early 50s. Same thing in Iraq. They throw the French out of Algeria. That takes a long time, but they do it. The Libyans throw the British and the Italians in 1950 out of Libya. In other words, you see a story of success. And so if you're an Arab, eventually, by the way, in the late 60s, the British were kicked out of what we call today Aden, South Yemen, and those places. Kuwait used to be a British protectorate, and then it isn't. So you see a definite pattern. So that always confirms theoreticians. They say, see, the trend of history is moving the way we predicted, so we represent an unstoppable force. And then you run into Israel. Well, the way it's supposed to be is like this. And then in 1967, Israel was destroyed. You understand? And that would be part of the grand narrative. Oops, something happened. So, they couldn't explain that. Okay, now theoreticians of Arab nationalism did explain pilpholistically how the defeat of the Six-Day War could be understood through the prism of the ideology of Arab nationalism. But as they say in the yeshivas, it was clear to everybody that Kasha was stronger than the terrorists. You understand? If they said, well, because Israel was supported by America and also was this and that, once you start going like this and that and the other, it's not a very satisfying explanation. And really, it should have been that the mighty and powerful Arab world that I showed you in that map should have crushed Israel, and why did it not happen? And could it be the fault lies within? No, I can't be. Well, then what is the reason? You see? And again, if you're an Arab thinker, a writer, philosopher, political philosopher, theoretician, and it's the late 60s, you're going nuts to try to explain the current situation. That's what's happening. They can't handle this. How could it be that the mighty Egyptian Empire was just destroyed in 5 minutes? Wasn't even a war of attrition. I just want you to take off your Jewish glasses for a minute and put on, if you can, Arab glasses and look at that picture. They can't handle the paratroopers on the Har-Bayas in 60s. It's extremely disconcerting. That's an understatement. And how do you deal with that extremely negative reality if you're an Arab, especially an Arab nationalist? What do you do about that? And this is a problem. And finally, the death of Nasser in 1973, years after the Six-Day War, and his replacement by Sadat, that was a huge blow. That was a makav patish, really, the final blow to Arab nationalism, because there was no replacement for Nasser. And Sadat was not an Arab nationalist, he was an Egyptian nationalist, which is a different thing. Okay? Of all the Arab countries, Egypt is a real country. You can argue Iraq never existed, and that's true. You can argue Sudan never existed, and that's true. You can do so for most of the Arab countries. They're fake in the sense of having history. There's never been a country, at least that I can think of, called Syria. I don't know of such a country. There were different Arams back in the biblical time, Aram Damascus, Aram Tov, all the rest of it, but there wasn't a country called Syria. And so forth and so on. There was a country called Egypt. Maybe you heard of it. You understand? No, there really is an Egyptian nationalism. That's a country with a long tradition. And so Sadat comes from the Egyptian peasant family structure. To him, Egypt was all about. Now, of course, theoretically, he pays lip service to Arab nationalism and all the rest. He doesn't really care. His goal, and I don't blame him, is to make a strong and particularly a prosperous Egypt. If he can make Egypt like America, that everybody has, a car and all the rest of it, he's successful. If he made Egypt great in that regard, which of course he could not do for a whole bunch of reasons. But that's where his ambitions and vision lie. And the same thing was true for many of the others. Now, therefore, if Nasser is not replaced, and finally, the inability after the Six-Day War to recover the occupied territories was extremely embarrassing to Arab nationalism. Can't we get our act together and force Israel out of the West Bank? What's wrong with us? Look at the map I just showed you. You got your Morocco, you got your Libya, you got the Arabs are tens of millions. Why can't they get one big army and just walk over Israel? Theoretically, it ought to work. There's so many of them. Right? There's so many of them. And the Arabs, the Saudi Arabians got the money. And Egypt has the manpower. You see like that, you're thinking like that. And can crush them in all different ways. Why can't we do it? And they couldn't do it. So this drove like a dagger through the heart of the theories of the relevancy of Arab nationalism. So as a result, although lip service was paid to this in the 1970s, in reality, it was dead. The problem, my friends, goes as follows. If one ideal is gone, then what replaces it? Because no society lasts without an ideal. Okay, people need some sort of ideal. Even in the United States of America and the materialistic West in general, we have, especially today, what I would recall the ideal of a modern, prosperous, truly liberal, and truly open society. Would you agree with that? That's the model. What's the perfect America to most people? Nobody bothers anybody. Everybody respects everybody. Everybody does well. Everybody has a car. Everybody has a pair of shoes. The air conditioning works. Your mortgage is paid. That's it. Life is good. You understand? So it's not ideal like you had in the Crusades, but it's an ideal. Okay? It's not a bit. What I mean by that is, I don't only want myself to do well. Of course I want that, and my family. But I want, if I'm an idealistic person, I would like everybody in the United States to do it. Why wouldn't I? If it doesn't hurt me, I don't want poverty in the United States. Do you? I don't want suffering and crime in the United States. Do you? So that's the ideal, okay? And in economy, it's true that there's a certain hedonistic material ideal in all this, but that speaks to people. People voted for Trump, and all joking aside, he represents a certain materialistic ideal, which is I will get the unemployed workers their jobs, I'll take people off the unemployment rolls, we'll make America great again, as the expression goes. I mean, he's touching buttons on that. In the East, in those days, it was communism. Communism is supposed to be an ideal, but again, it's a materialist ideal. Now, the communist ideal is like this: you'll have shoes, which they couldn't deliver. The problem is that what the reality was, they're all lining up to get shoes and there are no shoes. The communist ideal was there'll be toilet paper, which is why all the Soviet Jews in my youth, they came here, they said, America has communism. Because what was described as the ideal situation, you would tuck a head over here. How many, there may be people in the audience, they came to America, you took them to the supermarket, they said, this must be a Potemkin village. You understand? No, it's a real thing. Wow, this is the real communism. But over there you couldn't have it. So the East in the 1970s, if not before, but certainly 1970s, became rotten to the core, ideologically hollow. Because the ideal of the society was not a religious one, it was a materialistic one, and it was clear that they could not deliver the material goods, and the West could. People weren't stupid. They all met tourists, or they saw TV or a movie, and they saw in the West, people have. Here they don't. It's always relative. The famous story of the Grapes of Wrath. They made that movie in 1940 to tell how bad things were in America during the Depression. Henry Fonda, The Grapes of Wrath. And that's the one movie Stalin permitted in Russia. Because he said, oh boy, you'll see how bad it is. No, it didn't work. They said, they got shoes. Right? The guy was driving a jalopy. Remember when they drive across America? And they got a car. You know what I'm saying? So he pulled the movie. Because, choose your gods carefully. That's all I'm saying. Now, what about the Middle East? What's the ideal? If it's not going to be this Arab nationalism I just described, which turns out to be a poof, or just a mirage, so then what's the ideal? The short answer is going to be the rise of the religious ideal. But that only starts at that time. The problem we're facing today. At that time, all that happened in the 70s was the establishment of various ruthless dictatorships. Okay? That's when these guys took over. Gaddafi takes in 1970. Saddam Hussein, if you know the Iraqi politics, starts his rise significantly in 1970. He takes over Syria in 1970. This is the dictator of Yemen. This is the dictator also in 1969, 1970 of Sudan. And so on and so forth. The screen is not big enough for all of them. The point is, this becomes the pattern. Instead of delivering a materialist ideal, instead of delivering an Arab cultural ideal of one great nation, you get this. Okay? You keep the same little state structures. There still is Jordan. There still is South Yemen. There still is Kuwait. There still is Iraq. But each one's got a dictator. And I mean a ruthless dictator, okay? A ruthless dictator. So, even the PLO, you're going to have the following situation. A dictator without a country. Right? Because the PLO does not develop into a democratic organization. If you cross Arafat, you're gone. So it's funny. There's no country, but there is a dictatorship. Because that's the pattern that they know. Now, they know other patterns, but that's the pattern that seems, what can I say? That's the plant that takes root in the Middle East. Okay, that's the plant that takes. The other kind of plant, it's like, it doesn't develop roots. We wish it did. We're Americans. We're idealists. It doesn't take roots. This is sad. Now, interestingly, the 1970s, if you know anything about recent history, saw the rise of the Asian dictatorships. But the Asian dictatorships, at least, delivered the goods of materialism. So, here's the dictator of, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. He made a dictatorship, but he did something with it. He gave everybody a big standard of living. Here's Park Chung-hee, the guy who turned South Korea into South Korea. Again, he's a ruthless dictator, but at least he got the people running water, eventually air conditioning, eventually, the material goods. Here's the Pinochets, in Chile, where they stopped the crazy inflation and eventually brought in a stable country. They brought in prosperity into into Chile, even though it was a fascist dictator. They're delivering the goods. In the Arab world, you get their version of stagflation. You get your dictators and bad economy. You get your dictators plus a bad economy. Life doesn't get better for anybody. See, in these Asian situations or whatever, at least they give you the following plea. Stay out of politics and enjoy the rising economy. That's what it is. Really, it's interesting. In Korea and Singapore and these other places, just Mr. Nifsarain in politics, you don't need to. You got a family, go to bar mitzvah, go to the christening, have a picnic on Sunday, enjoy your new color TV, have your air conditioning, and let us at the top run the politics. So, as an American, we say, no, that's not right. But from many places in the world, they say, halavai, we should have that. But in the Arab country, you don't have either of those. Right? It's not like Assad says, I'm going to turn Syria into a bustling paradise. Now, you know who does that today? But it's most unusual in your Gulf states. Right? In Abu Dhabi, they have so much money, it's ridiculous. I mean, there's so much money, they can afford to give everybody free medical, free housing, free this and free that, because they can just awash in money. Not because they're so enlightened, but they got money to burn. They literally have money to burn. But that's a tiny group. Not in the other dictatorships. Okay? That's a tiny group. Now, in the 70s, this didn't happen. The Arabs, dictators I'm talking about, they can't deliver the economic goods. Right? They can't do it. On the contrary, the standard of living goes down in the 1970s and afterwards. Why? Mainly because of Pru-Urvu. Because you have a gigantic population explosion. The governments either encourage a huge population explosion, or it just happens without the government encouragement. And if you don't have a good economy, an expanding economy, then maybe this worked when you had maybe it worked when you had 5 million people, but it doesn't work when you have 15 million people and you haven't increased the number of schools, you haven't increased the number of water to service the houses and the toilets and things like that, and the roads and all the rest of it. You end up with these cities in which there's no traffic situation because there's 1 million cars. They're not built for 15 million. They're only built for 5 million. And the 70s is really when the population explosion takes off in the Arab world, 70s, 80s, 90s, and afterwards. And the governments... Now, I'm talking with the perspective of hindsight, but that's what I'm doing over here. The good thing about history is you get to talk about dead people. They can't answer back. You look back in the 70s, you see what happened. The things all expanded like crazy, the populations. There was no serious attempt on the part of the government to commit serious resources to trying to deal with this kind of problem. There was no Menachem Begin, if I can say so. Let's have a project slums. None of that kind of thing. That doesn't exist with Assad and Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and these other characters. It doesn't work like that, right? Instead, what you get is a kleptocracy. Any money around you, grab it. And the result is that the public gets the shaft. As a result, the Arab world, which potentially could have taken on Israel in the 1970s, if you were with me, was it 2 years ago? We went through the Yom Kippur War last year, 2 years ago. Israel was on the edge. And if you paid very close attention to what I said, on the northern front, they did beat back the Syrians. But then, serious Iraqi forces started coming in large numbers. And the first group made a mistake and Israel wiped them out. But there were plenty coming after them and Israel could not take them on. And that's when, fortunately for Israel, the ceasefire kicked in. and the war in the north stopped. If it would keep on going, Israel cannot handle a war of attrition like that. They just can't handle it. As it is, they lost 800 killed on the northern front, and that was the better of the two fronts, if you remember. And they consider that a gigantic loss that they can't handle. If they would get involved in a major war with the Iraqi army, bringing in hundreds and thousands of new tanks and soldiers and armored personnel carriers and all this other junk, Israel would be up to here in big trouble. So the Arab world, which potentially could have taken on Israel in the 70s, didn't. They did not. Now, the dictators couldn't get their act together in order to do that. They had other priorities, to be frank. The dictators that I'm talking about, the ones you see on the pictures, were the opposite of charismatic Nasser figures. Nasser, at least, rightly or wrongly, had the imagination, the enthusiasm of the Hamon Am. For a whole bunch of reasons. He really did have that. But not these guys. How does Gaddafi, who's a stupid dictator, have the enthusiastic support of Libya? And at that time, we weren't as smart as we are now, that Libya is really a collection of tribes in which one group hates the other. We've learned that over the years as different parts of the Arab world crack up, and then all of a sudden the news discovers the reality. But at that time, they saw it's one big blob. He's not popular. He's a dictator. He's setting up a police state. If you don't cheer for him, he'll kill you. That's not a charismatic thing. Same thing for Assad. Same thing for Saddam Hussein. Same thing for all across the Arab world, frankly, right? Boumediene in Algeria. You can go through all the names. So these aren't people who can inspire their population to have a long war with Israel involving suffering and privation. And since they weren't, this was good for Israel. You get it? Best thing that happened and I'm speaking very cynically and ruthlessly now, best thing that happened to Israel in the 70s was the country was taken over by what I would call losers. Meaning they know how to ruthlessly control their country, but they can't organize it properly to get their country in a healthy situation and then move to the next step of taking on Israel. They have too much trouble just holding on to their own. So when Menachem Begin made peace with Egypt in the late 1970s, the conventional war option pretty much disappeared. Because how are you going to take on Israel if Egypt's not going to be part of it? And that is exactly why Israel was so enthusiastic about making a peace with Egypt, even though it involved complete and total pullout from the entire Sinai Desert, Sinai Peninsula, which Begin was not crazy about, but he did it. Okay? Now, I just said something that sounds good. But theoretically, there could have been a war in the late 70s, early 80s. If you combine Syria plus Iraq plus Jordan, they could take Israel. I mean, look, if Israel gets attacked from Jordan, from Syria, and from Iraq, it's called the North and Eastern Front, to the north and to the east. So even if Egypt doesn't participate, assuming you could trust them, Israel would have its hands full and could be defeated. So, even though I just said, when Egypt pulled out of the equation, Israel has a peace, it's not so simple. And in the late 70s and early 80s, Israel was plenty worried about what I just described, which could have happened. The IDF, I know, was plenty worried about this. Remember, the Syrians had fought ferociously in the Yom Kippur War. They didn't run. And Israel cannot sustain an attrition war. Again, I don't expect you to remember everything, but the Israelis kicked them out back into the Golan. As soon as the Israelis went over the line into Syria, the Syrians fought hard for each and every inch. So if you're the Russian army, you don't mind losing 1 million men? No. But if you're Israel, everybody counts. It's not so simple. So if there really would have broken out a war between Israel on the one hand and Jordan plus Syria plus Iraq on the other, Israel would have a real dangerous situation on its hands. And Israel, Menachem Begin, it knows this. Fortunately, this did not materialize for a number of reasons. First of all, the biggest of these three countries is Iraq. That's the biggest problem. They have the largest population, 17 million. They have the biggest army. They have the most resources. They got oil up to here, as we know, in those days. They could have taken on Israel, or at least it seemed that way. But fortunately, the Yetzer Hara turned them into east. In 79, Saddam Hussein invades Iran and starts the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted for 9 years. From Israel's point of view, not long enough. And in the Iran-Iraq war, what do I mean it looks like the First World War? It was a trench warfare. They were evenly matched. So Iraq attacked the Iranians, pushed them back a little bit, and then later on vice versa, and then later on vice versa. It was like the Western Front in World War I. So what does that mean? Millions died and were wounded, destroyed. Whole generation of Iraqi kids and Iranian kids and all the rest of it. Now, neither of them is good. If they had peace, they would attack Israel, which is why Menachem Begin said, I wish I saw it to everybody in this war. You understand? But on the other hand, the clash was large and violent. And if you recall this, not that you need to, it sucked in all the Arab states. Because Iraq found that when they take on Iran, they had their hands full. The Iranians were pretty powerful, even though the Iraqis had a lot of Soviet weapons and things like that. And eventually they called in help full time from all the other Arab countries. And the Arab countries did help them. From our perspective today, that we're older and wiser, and we've learned more, we totally understand this. Because the Arab world is scared to death of Iran. That's why Saudi Arabia, for example, is now kissing up with Israel secretly. You find that in the news all the time, because they're really worried about Iran. So already in 1979, 1980, and 81 and all that, they're worried about Iran. This is how Egypt was received as a Baal Tshuva into the Arab nationalism after the death of Sadat. All the Arabs had boycotted Egypt. They broke relations with him, all the rest of it. But then in 1983 and afterwards, they needed help from Egypt also. And so the successor, Mubarak, said, we'll help Iraq, and in return, come back into the fold. So now you're part of the Arab world again. And he did do so. So all I'm saying is, Iraq is not in a situation from 1979 to 1988 to attack Israel. Okay? They got their hands usually full over here. Now, by the way, after that war's over, which was a stalemate like World War I, it ended up with stalemate. After the war was over, then he did indeed, Saddam Hussein, turn to the idea of attacking Israel. Baruch Hashem, he preceded that with an attack on Kuwait, and that took him down. You understand? But he was already, I remember this, you already had Iraqi units and officers being noticed by Israel on the Jordan River border, scoping out Israel for an Iraqi move into Jordan, with Jordan's agreement, and then a major war against Israel. But as they say, fortunately, he went to Kuwait, he got George Bush angry, and then the whole thing unraveled on him. So there is an atheistic explanation for this, and there are other explanations as well. But there you have it. Now, consequently, what I just described was good for Israel, and Begin, for the rest of his term, did not have to worry about a conventional, symmetric war on the part of the Arabs. Because if Egypt is out of it, and if Iraq is out of it, it's not happening. It's not happening. The other danger was Syria, which, thanks to the Russians, was built up pretty powerfully. Or at least that's how we perceived it at the time. If you really, and Syria is much bigger than Israel. Look at that. Syria is much bigger than Israel. But did we know the true facts? For example, look what I'm doing. This whole area that I'm doing with my pointer is a midbar, it's a desert. So there's nobody there. So Syria looks big, but it's more hollow than it seems. But I remember we all were scared to death. What's Assad going to do? And how's it going to react? And what's the Carter going to do? And Reagan later on. Syria, in hindsight, was hollow in many respects. First of all, and we've learned this again by hindsight, so I'm speaking 40 years later, there is no such thing as the Syrian people. Rather, the country is composed of different groups who hate each other. The country looks this way if you do a political map, but it looks this way if you do an ethnic and religious map. Okay? You got your Sunnis, you got your Shiites, you got your, the Kurds over there, the Druze, and one group, and each one's out to get the other. As we see in this last decade with this murderous, how many civilians in our time, recent years, were killed in the Syrian civil war? 1 million. Maybe more. Nobody does anything about it. By the way, using poison gas and all sorts of junk. Mubarak says he's going to do something about it. Nothing happened. I'm not Mubarak, Obama, I'm sorry. He says, no, seriously, nothing. I'm just saying, the notion of a big and powerful Syria going to take on Israel looks a little bit funny from our perspective today. But we didn't know it at the time. More specifically, The ruling elite in Syria is the Alawite minority, which is hated by the Sunni majority. Again, this is something that's commonplace today if you just follow general news, because this has been the civil war recently in the last 10 years. To put it all in clear terms, although I've spoken tonight in terms of the movement of Arab nationalism, whose heyday was in the 50s and the early 60s, there was always a competing group in those years in the Arab world, a competing group for political power in all these countries. What was that group? The Muslim Brotherhood. Called under different names, but that's what it is. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, where it started, and in Syria, and in Lebanon, and in Jordan, and Iraq, and all these other countries. They're always there. The dictator regimes were opposed by the Muslim Brotherhood. So notice, they fought a war against Gaddafi, let's say, in Libya, from 1970, all through the 70s, all through the 80s, all through the... I just want you to understand this, because nobody knew this at the time, what they call the fake news. They're so superficial in their treatment, they don't understand what's going on in these countries. And all this time, in the early 2000s, until Gaddafi was overthrown and killed by Muslim Brotherhood types. In Syria, as you'll see in a minute, there was a continual war from 1970, actually from 1960, by the Muslim Brotherhood to try to take over the country against the different cliques that ruled Syria. And same thing in this country, same thing in that country. Sadat eventually was shot by Muslim Brotherhood types. And I showed you that movie the other day. Israel actually saved his life once when they overheard them trying to kill him back in 1977. So this is a reality. It's there. The dictator regimes were opposed by the Muslim Brotherhood, who wanted not a political dictatorship, but a theocratic dictatorship, which at least, in theory, is modified by Sharia law. Do you get what I'm saying? No, to live under religious law is to live under a law. Is that clear? That's interesting. That's the appeal. It's not a total capricious dictatorship. You just pull anybody and do whatever you want. The idea is there are rules, and if you follow the rules, you'll be okay. That's the theory of Sharia law. I'll give you an example. If you're Jewish in the past, not in the 20th century, in the past, if you lived in a Muslim Arab country, if you follow the rules and don't act uppity and do all this kind of stuff, then you can survive. You get it? So this is the attraction of the Muslim Brotherhood. The dictatorships always realized that the Muslim Brotherhood was their opponent, and so the dictatorships in all these countries used the power of the state to destroy or suppress the Muslim Brotherhood. Nasser did it, Sadat much less, but he also did it, Assad, all these other countries. Now, again, it's weird. I grew up at that time like you, many of you did. We didn't see this in the newspapers. We didn't see this in the Time magazines. We didn't see this in the business. Only people that are super specialists apparently knew about all this stuff. The public was a gailam. We saw countries. We saw blue being Syria, and red being Iraq, and orange being Lebanon, and purple being Egypt. And it's not like that. This is the problem with geography. Geography is cool if you're in the 6th grade. Geography doesn't really tell you what's going on just by this externalist kind of focus. But what's the teacher supposed to do in 11th grade in the high school summer? Give you a sociological analysis of the situation in Lebanon? Give me a break, That'd be great if you know the capital. But that actually doesn't work. You know something? If you're Israel, that's not enough. Now, to be perfectly honest, the Israelis, who have their own, shall I say, arrogant attitudes, I don't think they knew too much about what I'm saying either. You see, only when it came on the doorstep and they had to know it. I'm not going to go this year into the Israeli invasion of Lebanon because that comes next year. But when Israel went into Lebanon, they made many mistakes based on their lack of knowledge, and they paid the price for it. In the same way that the U.S. made the mistake in the Vietnam. They had no idea of all the ethnic and religious and this kind of stuff. Remember that monk that burned themselves? Are you old enough to remember that? We had no idea. Like they're persecuting the Buddhists over there. Who knew? You understand? And that's the same thing in the Middle East. It's a very complex kind of a situation. And so there's a constant war, a ruthless war, a terrorist war, and a counter-terrorist war. The only question is, who are the terrorists and who are the counter-terrorists? It just depends who you ask. If you ask the Muslim Brotherhood, the regime is the terrorist. Well, you can make a good argument Saddam Hussein's a terrorist. He just grabbed power. You can make a good argument that Assad is a terrorist. He just grabbed power. So we're the counter-terrorists. Of course, if you're a secular government, you say, we're the counter-terrorists, and the Muslim crazies, the Brotherhood, they're the terrorists. And that's the nature of what's going on in these countries all during the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and frankly down till today. The dictatorships realized from day one that the Muslim Brotherhood was their opponent, so all the dictatorships used the power of the state to suppress and destroy the Muslim Brotherhood. The dictators realized the existential potential power of the Muslim Brotherhood due to what I call the Shimon ben Shetach factor, because now we're finishing Hanukkah, and what happened after Hanukkah? Eventually, the Maccabees or their successors set up a state, the Hasmonean state, the only Jewish state in the Bayesheni period, in the Second Temple period. When they did, things really fell apart because you had I won't call it the Muslim Brotherhood, I call it the Jewish Brotherhood. The Jewish Brotherhood was with the Pharisees, and they wanted to set up a theocratic state. The Hasmonean princes wanted to set up their own kleptocracy, dictatorship type state. And what was the result? A major civil war, right? The same business. And whenever the Hasmonean rulers made the mistake of allowing the Pharisees to be left alone, then like under Shimon ben Shetach, established yeshivas everywhere, or to use the term that we say today, madrasas. And next thing you know, the whole young generation got frumized. And in those days, it wasn't a matter of Lakewood, it was a matter of political. And civil war broke out. And 50,000 Jews, I might remind you, perished in the war of Yanai versus the Pharisees, and including mass, crucifixions. This is Jew and Jew, and business like that. Same thing at that time. If you're a ruler of an Arab state, you got to watch the Islam very closely. You can't go and say no mosques and no madrasas. That won't work. But instead, what you have to say is like this: you can have them, but we got to watch every single teacher, every single cleric. You understand? And you can't. You can't. And so what you're really doing is, little by little, they're doing a Shimon ben Shetach. They're converting the younger generation to their ideals, and that's what you got. And consequently, you have many people that are college graduates and all the rest of it, and MDs, and they're serious fighters in and supporters of ISIS and Taliban and all these other groups. And the West is trying to figure out, gee, why did it happen? Remember those girls from London who were the children of a doctor, and they had everything at their disposal, and they ran off and joined the Taliban as fighters or concubines or whatever they did. And people couldn't figure out what it is. But in the frum world, we understand what that is. Okay? We understand what that is? And so, in the case of Syria, I said before Israel was worried about Syria maybe attacking Israel. Who knew? The guy sitting on a powder keg. I'm talking about Hafez Assad. Look at this. The first clash between the secular Ba'ath Party and the Islamist Brotherhood, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, in Syria occurred in 1963. Whoa! Way before, long ago. Who knew? Right? In which the Ba'ath Party gained power in Syria. From the start, the Muslim Brotherhood, of which it was the most powerful, represented the strongest opposition to the Syrian government. Now, wait a minute. The Syrian government is radical Arab nationalists. They're Baathists. They are the proponents of everything I talked about at the beginning of my talk tonight. They're really into all that Arab stuff, all the rest of it. But by the standards of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're puzzle. They're apikursim, they're bad, they sold out, and so on and so forth. And the outlawing of the Brotherhood resulted in radicalization. In 64 and 65, strikes and mass demonstrations spread throughout Syria, Hama especially, and were crushed by the military. Who knew? Right? The town of Hama was a stronghold of landed conservative Muslim Brotherhood, long redoubtable opponent of the Ba'athist state. In 1983, I hope next year we'll see, Assad exterminated them. Okay? It's called the Hama massacre. He will go in there and just kill everybody. Because he said it's the only thing you can do. So, block by block. Okay? So, in 73, this is just before, January, this is just before the Yom Kippur War. Who knew? In 73, Assad implemented a new constitution which led to a national crisis. Unlike previous constitutions, the new one did not require the president of Syria to be a Muslim. Because, of course, he is not a Muslim, he's Alawite. Okay? Leading the fierce demonstration in Hama, Homs, and Aleppo, organized by the Brotherhood and the clergy. Who knew? So, again, what's the problem? Syria is an Arab country. No, he's an Arab. No, an Arab country means you have a Sunni Muslim as the leader. You guys can be second-class citizens. You understand? No, I'm serious. The dhimmis and all that. You can be there. You can have Christians, all the rest of it. Don't be uppity. Because otherwise you violate what's called the Pact of Omar, as they understand Islamic law, in which the second class and third class have to know their place. You shine my shoes. That's what you do. You don't become president of the country. And what was this? They labeled Assad as the enemy of Allah and called for a jihad against his rule. Robert Kaplan, the professor, compared Assad's coming to power to a Jew becoming Tsar of Russia, meaning to a Sunni Muslim majority population. It's unthinkable. Right? It's horrible that a non-Sunni Muslim should become the president of the country. As I said before, this is not the Midwest, it's the Mideast. Okay? We're Americans, we have our culture. They have a different culture. The West is the West and the East is the East. An unprecedented development shocking to the Sunni majority population, which monopolized power for so many centuries. So again, I keep saying this. Now, wait a minute. The externalist fake news of our youth really did a disservice to us, the readers of the New York Times, etc. We had no idea of the turmoil in Syria. So 3 months, listen closely, I'm about to show you. 3 months after Begin and Sadat signed the peace treaty, which was vociferously denounced by Assad as treason to the Arabs, and it's a terrible thing to the Arab nation and all the rest of it, the Muslim Brotherhood made a terrorist attack. They killed out the whole West Point of Syria. It's like a movie of Errol Flynn, right? They exterminated the entire graduate class at the West Point, indicating Sadat spoke for no one other than his own clique, which had a stranglehold over power, but that's all they had. Look at this. It's called the Aleppo Artillery School Massacre. Who knew? In 79, massacre of the Syrian army cadets by members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which were part of the uprising of 76 to 82, a 6-year uprising. So we thought, oh, Gewalt, Syria fell apart under Obama. Not true. It happens every once in a while. They burp, that's how it goes over there. All right? The massacre occurred in June 6, 1979. Well, the peace treaty was the late March of 79. Okay? Peace 79. In the removed district of Aleppo, an officer on duty, Ibrahim al-Yusuf, and members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, so these are guys who are military officers, secretly they're part of the Muslim Brotherhood. You get it? This is the problem. You can't tell one apart. Secretly members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who called themselves the Fighting Vanguard, and led by this guy, massacred between 50 and 83 Alawi cadets in the artillery school. This is their West Point. The duty officer in charge of the school called all the cadets to an urgent meeting in the mess hall, and then they shot him. Look at that. They called him in, he says, I have a special announcement. It's Al Capone. You remember the St. Martin Bartholomew massacre? I got an announcement. Everybody come. All those in the bathroom, hurry up, let's go. Right? This incident marked the beginning of a full-scale warfare of the Brotherhood against the ruling Alawites. Oh my goodness. And, now, do you ever hear Jimmy Carter say anything about this? Do you ever hear Walter Cronkite say anything about this? Do you ever hear anybody say about this? And this is not a clan cut, you understand? We didn't know. I'm trying to show you that just as in the world of science and medicine, there's a gap between the discovery of it and the time it actually gets mentally absorbed into the thinking of the scientists, the physicians, the practitioners, all the rest of it. There's a gap. Nowadays, it's less of a gap because of modern technology. But there used to be, somebody finds a hard thing over here, but it takes 10 years till it spreads to America and the other places. So knowledge, genuine knowledge of what's going on in the Arab world, or what I call the Arab world, which isn't really so Arab, doesn't hit the West for 20 years, 30 years afterwards. That's my point today. Now, the reason I'm sharing this level of detail with you is to show that Hafiz Assad wasn't really in a mood to attack Israel. He said it, he did all this kind of stuff, but it was a baloney, Baruch Hashem. He had his hands full in his own country with the Muslim Brotherhood, and if anything would have gone wrong in a war with Israel, his regime would have been weakened, and the Muslim Brotherhood would have seized power. Now, frankly, I think that's why Syria did not fight harder in the Yom Kippur War. Why did they keep up the war of attrition against Israel since they knew Israel couldn't handle it? The answer is since he got his head handed to him by the IDF in the Golan Heights fighting, even though he had still plenty of fight left in him, he said, if I lose more men, this is going to cause the country to rise up against me, and I can't handle that, so I'd rather make peace with Israel now and pursue a political situation with Kissinger and Nixon, get back something, which he did get back, than to go for the military option, which could leave my whole country blowing up under me. Okay? Now, this has happened many times in history. How did the Soviets come to power in Russia? Because the war was getting out of hand under the Tsar, and he couldn't stop it, and therefore the whole country blew up under his feet. So this is always a factor that you have to keep in mind when you deal with Israel versus other countries. Okay, Israel versus other countries. Unfortunately, my friends, this is not a factor when you deal with Israel versus asymmetrical organizations. When they fight the Hamas and these other groups, they don't have these structures and they don't have this problem. Right? I'm sorry to say. This is why Israel's problem today is not the countries, it's because of these groups. You understand this? It's strange how this has morphed in our time, but that's what happened. That's why the Syrian border in the Galilee was always quiet. Everybody always wondered about that. How come, you figure Assad hates Israel so much, that should be where all the terrorism is. But anybody who's been in Israel in the last 30 years knows, if you went up there, it wasn't a problem. Why? In addition, Assad and his fellow kleptocrats, because that's what they were, as a clique, he gave his brother to own all the car industries, and he gave his brother-in-law to own the movie industry, and he gave a cousin, I'm serious, to own all the gas stations, and that's how they do business in that part of the world. So he and his fellow kleptocrats so messed over the Syrian economy that it shrunk. If you look at the numbers now, and again, hindsight is wiser. If you look at the economic numbers, you have negative growth in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s under Assad. Do you understand? Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. Here in America we talk about 2%. Trump said, I got up to 3.5%. Assad got it down to negative 2%. You're saying negative 3%. And the reason is simple. The population is increasing so fast, and any funds that could be used to finance new industries or set up new schools or hospitals are going to somebody's Swiss bank account. That's what happens. The result is the public now has worse possibilities of health care than they had years before. The public now has worse possibilities of public school than they had before, and so on and so forth. And so, let's put it this way. He really messed them up so much, ad kedei kach, and I'm going to tell you something that you think is funny, but you understand, and it is funny, but I don't mean it to be funny. If you talk to a Syrian Sunni today of the middle variety, they'll tell you that Hafez Assad was the most successful Israeli spy in history. You understand? These two guys, Eli Cohen and Hafez Assad, were the two most powerful and successful guys in Israel. In the person of Assad, Israel penetrated to the top of the Syrian power structure, and for 30 years he messed over the country. And why do they say that? Nobody could have done as much damage to Syria as Assad, and cui bono. And they can't understand in their world, no, you did it to yourself, get it? It's your fault. It doesn't work like that. If somebody really messed us over, he was really sent by enemy headquarters. I kid you not. The same way that people have trouble understanding the mentality I keep bringing over and over again, I bring with sorrow. If you ask most people today in the world, in 2018, who did the 9/11? Most people say it was Israel, it's the Mossad. Right? Facts have nothing to do with it, or they'll say like this, your facts are wrong and our facts are right. There's no question that Israel did it. In the same way, if you go to Syria now, and go to the Sunni areas which have been crushed by Assad's forces as we speak, through barrel bombs, chemical weapons, and 100 other things. They'll say, why is it? Oh, he's working for the Mossad. He's not even a Muslim. No Muslim could do this. The horrors that he's perpetrated could not be Arab. It's clear. And by the way, I heard his real name wasn't Assad, it was Schwartz, This is, if you go on the jihadist websites, you find this. Now, me, myself, and I don't care. It could be, Bashar al-Oberstein. It's okay with me. But I'm just saying, they will communicate to their children, the next generation, you know who caused the civil war in Syria? Who was it? It's Israel. We have a whole generation of kids. This is bad. Whole generation of kids coming up and saying, for 50 years, from 1970 to 2018 almost, Syria, unfortunately, was ruled by two Mossad agents, and they caused all the damage to Israel. And you couldn't have figured out a more brilliant plan to mess over Syria than the Assads. Now, that part is true, but they came up with that on their own. But they can't see it that way. And finally, in the late 1970s, Assad is busy intervening in Lebanon, and therefore doesn't have time to attack Israel. Okay, and herein lies the tale. For a Syrian nationalist, and Hafiz Assad is a Syrian nationalist, but as I just told you, that's almost a joke. Why is that a joke? There never was a Syrian nation. That's created after 1945. Lebanon is part of Syria. What do I mean? If you go back to the French mandate after World War I, look, it's all one. Correct? In the same way that Palestine was one, what we call Israel and Jordan was one thing, and then Churchill split it and made a separate country. Similarly, the French, for their reasons we'll see in a minute, took a piece of Syria and called it Lebanon, made a separate country. So if you're a real super Syrian nationalist, they have no right to do that. And therefore, one day we want to reunite Syria with Lebanon. Now, the Lebanese don't want it. We can handle that. I will show you something else that the Rebbeinu Shalom put in long ago for this reason. You see this map? There's a little piece over here called Alexandretta. In 1938, France gave that to Turkey. So there's a bitter relation between Turkey and Syria till today. Believe you me. Just say Iskandarun, which is Alexandretta in Arabic. And immediately both sides fly up. And the Turks say it's ours and the Syrians say it's theirs. And that's one of the reasons why there's always been bad relations between Syria on the one hand and Turkey on the other hand, which until Erdogan meant that Turkey was friendly with Israel because they had a common enemy. You asked me a question. Why should Turkey be an enemy with Syria? Because Syria wants the Alexandretta and then we give it back. So this is how it goes in the Middle East. I can't help it. Geography matters. Now, Lebanon is a lot more complicated than that. Lebanon had a most unusual religious and ethnic history. And ordinarily, who cares? It's the next door neighbor of Israel. We got to care. When the Muslims conquered the Middle East back in the 7th century, in the days of the Caliphate, North Lebanon became a place of Christian holdouts. Isn't that interesting? Who Arabized but did not Islamize. So when the Arabs conquered this huge area, here, among other places, but concentrated in the hills and the mountains, a bunch of tribes who was left from the Byzantines. Notice they didn't want to become Muslims. Now they did start speaking Arabic language and all that sort of thing. And they dress, I guess, in Arabic, but they wear a cross. And they took it seriously, their Christianity. And as long as it was like a little weird thing on the side, they could sort of hold out. It's a very complicated history. I can't go into that now. For example, they liked the Crusaders, obviously, But nevertheless, there was always a certain bastion of non-Islamism in this area, what we would call today North Lebanon. And indeed, other non-Sunni groups concentrated there, turning Lebanon into an unusual corner of the Muslim world. It's like a dumping ground of non-Muslims. Look, you got your Christians, you got your Shiites. There are no Shiites in most of the Sunni Middle East, but you got them over here. This is a large number up to the Israeli border. You got your Christians. What else you got over here? You got Druze, okay? And all these they speak Arab, but they're not Arabs. They're not regular Arabs. They're not Muslim Arabs. You understand? And therefore, Lebanon was like a weirdism within the Arab world. At the time of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Maronites, who were the Christians, always looked to France and to Europe for succor, for help against the Ottoman tyranny. And the Ottomans, of course, hated that. Now, before the First World War, in the 1800s, when Turkey got weak and Europe got strong, so the Maronites lived an interesting, precarious existence under the Turks. The Turks couldn't do them what they would like to do, because if they did, like in 1860, the French landed an army to protect the Christians from being massacred. And the Turks couldn't do anything about it. They hated it. They could only wait it out and say, we're not going to persecute them, we're not going to punish them. And eventually the European troops withdrew. Okay? There was a whole Lebanese civil war at that time. But then in World War I, the Turks didn't have to worry about the French and the Europeans. And then they really stuck it to Lebanon. They imposed a great famine. You don't know this. Jamal Pasha, the Turkish commander, closed the area around the Maronites and wouldn't let any food in. And so like half their population died from starvation. We know about the Armenian massacres. Not so many people are familiar with the Maronite deaths, which took place in a starvation rather than killing mode, but did. And in addition to that, there was a giant, I don't know if you know this, there was a big locust plague in World War I. And they devastated the food there. The one place in the Ottoman Empire there wasn't a locust plague, Eretz Yisrael, was Palestine. I don't know if you guys were with me on my last trip to Israel. This is the Nili. Aaron Aronson, one of the early proto-Zionist leaders, was the guy who made Zichron Yaakov, the north of Zichron Yaakov, that agricultural situation. And he was a genius at the agriculture. He met Teddy Roosevelt and people from around the world. And the Turks, even though they suspected him of being a British agent, which he was, Jamal Pasha said like this: we got a Turkish army over here in Palestine. I give you total Herbert Hoover command of Palestine and Syria to fight the locusts, because you're the only one who knows how to do it. And in 1915, he said, empty this out, fill this place up with kerosene, do this, cover the crops with that. And like a dictator, he told everyone what to do, and they survived. Isn't that something? So a Jewish guy, who really is Zionist, he saved the high, because all the millions would have died, but the Jews also would have died. You see? In Yerushalayim, a place like that. There was no food. It was a starvation, and they stayed just ahead of the starvation. By the way, how did the Turks repay it? They took all the food away from the Jews in Jerusalem, and they would have all starved to death, but Woodrow Wilson sent a ship with food in 1915. That's a famous story. Now, anyhow, thanks to Louis Brandeis. Now, after World War I, Syria and Lebanon were given to the French as a mandate. The Maronites, the Christians in Lebanon, didn't want to be a minority in some future Sunni country, and the French, and the Maronites are kind of Catholic, they're a certain form of Catholic, so they sympathized with them. So the French carved out a state for them in the 20s and 30s, and namely Lebanon. So to help the Maronites, they tore out a piece of Syria. I'm just telling you, if you're a Syrian, this is how you hear it, right? And they even messed over others to help the Maronites. They said, the Christian area is too small, so we'll stick in a little Shiite, we'll stick in a little Druze, we'll stick in this, give you more of a country, right? And they did it unilaterally without getting the approval of the rest of the Syrians. And this left Lebanon with a very delicate body politic, because even in the best of circumstances, the Christians were like 55% of the population. And they don't have as many babies as the Muslims, so within 10 years they were a minority. This would have happened to Israel if they would have taken the 1947 deal. Do you get what I'm saying? So if the Arabs were smart, in 1947, November, when they partitioned Palestine into two states, they should have said, I guess, we accept. The Jewish state at that time had 55% Jew, 45% non-Jewish. Even if the Israelis would bring in a lot of Olim, even if the Arabs sooner or later would outnumber them, and then they would win without fighting a war. But to Israel's, which I say, a success, they immediately declared war on Israel, and by the time it's over, things radically changed. So in Lebanon, it didn't change. And the result is that the Sunnis don't like to be ruled by the infidels, especially when they're not when they're no longer in the numerical minority. The Sunnis now, today, are a numerical majority in Lebanon. Accordingly, Lebanon teetered from time to time on the precipice of civil conflict ever since it was established in 1943. Now, but it never quite happened for years. You remember Eisenhower sent the Marines in to prevent one of those collapses of Lebanon, and it worked. He sent Marines for a short time, and it worked, and he pulled them out. To add to the problem I just described, you have the Palestinian refugees after 48, because a lot of them ran away to Lebanon. Not all, but a lot of them went to Lebanon, and they're still there, and they're these very refugee camps, and they're Sunni Muslims. And they're foreigners, and Lebanon doesn't want to give them citizenship because they got enough trouble keeping the proportions between the Christians and the Druze and the others. We don't need this. Okay? And so the Maronites are acutely aware of their differentness in the Arab world. They're the only Christian group when they sit at the Arab League, right? You got Egypt, you got Libya, and then you got the Lebanon with the Christian guys. So they figure if they have to show sufficient Arab patriotism. Let's put it this way. They liked the Nasser era. Do you get that? Because it was secular. So it's all about being Arab. Oh, we're Arab. We speak Arab. We're against Israel. We side with you. Long live Nasser. Now leave us alone. And it worked. It worked. Okay? They figured they won't be bothered. That's why Lebanon invaded Israel in 48. You think they wanted to? You know, when Israel became a state, they're invaded by Jordan and by Egypt and by Syria, and by Lebanon. You say, Lebanon? What did Lebanon want to take from Israel? Seriously, what did they expect to get? Lebanon's a tiny country. Israel beat them 1-2-3. Why did they do that? You got to do it. Otherwise, you're going to be an Arab patriot. So we fought Israel, just like you. We didn't win, but we did our part. You get it? We did our part. And so, this is the crazy politics of the Middle East. Cynical self-interest guided Lebanese foreign policy up to 1967 and late 60s, which is vote against Israel, speak against Israel. It doesn't cost no money, right? And, cuss out the Jews, all the rest of it. And we're good Arabs. We're Christians. Well, we don't have to talk about that. We're Arabs, you see? It was in the 1970s that Lebanon's trouble started, and these would affect Israel down till today. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, the PLO started to get active, because until the Six-Day War, the Palestinians living in Lebanon were afraid of the Lebanese army and state getting in their way if they try to attack Israel, because Lebanon said, we don't want any trouble with Israel. But after the Six-Day War, the PLO becomes active. The refugee camps in Lebanon were one place where terrorists were recruited and from which they could launch guerrilla attacks on Israel. And the Israelis were still unused to asymmetrical warfare. And so the result was that Arafat and these guys always threw bombs and stuff into Israel and then pulled out. And what did Israel do? The only thing Israel can do is drop bombs on them and invade. And it's a mess. That's not the right answer. You understand? So they just kill a bunch of Lebanese and a bunch of Palestinians. But the truth is, the Palestinians won. Things got worse after the civil war in Jordan in 1970, because King Hussein wiped out the PLO who was trying to take over his country. And Arafat and the others ran away to Lebanon. Now Lebanon is the headquarters of the PLO. With armed groups, a population of Palestinians with a lot of armed groups, that's a cancer for any country in which it resided, because you have people who don't listen to law, they make their own laws. It's a Dodge City. And if Jordan barely survived, and Jordan has a strong military, Lebanon with its weak and ethnically precarious military was in a mess. And remember that the Palestinians are Sunni, by the way. So that matters. Now, as a result, if you're talking about Menachem Begin's time, the second half of the 70s, Lebanon is a place where PLO groups roam all over the place in jeeps in the street, armed to the teeth, and become more and more mafia-like all the time. Because once you take over a neighborhood, you want to squeeze it, and this and that and the other, and if a guy likes a girl, and you can just imagine. As the Christians see the PLO groups running around dominating life, they form their private armies. And soon the Druze formed their private armies. Why not? And what happens? The Lebanese policemen cease to exist. It's just a bunch of groups of fighting, killing. It's a terrible place to live. The worst person is the nice, normal Lebanese individual who, you walk in this street, you get attacked and killed by this group. You walk in that street, you get attacked by a group. And what do you do? Okay? Now, it became Dodge City. In 1975, a civil war really broke out. And it's not so much a civil war as a war between mafias, the PLO mafias and the Maronite and the Druze militias. And what happens is a whole bunch of St. Bartholomew's, I said it wrong, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, that's what I meant, right? Actually, like Dodge City. Like Chicago, Al Capone. You end up with St. Valentine's Day Massacres, right and left. They just line people up and shoot them. And really turns into a Marlon Brando situation, Because, no, I'm serious. That's what Arafat is for the PLO, and that's what this guy Jamal is for the Christians, and the Druze have this guy, I forget his name, and and each one has their godfather, and it's mamish a godfather situation. Help me, I'll help you, but you join my army, you do this, that's how it goes. If the country is full of this, it's not a country anymore. If the country is full, it's not a country. And so, until now, the story is simple. Now it gets complicated. Right? Just give me 2 more minutes. The PLO group started winning by being more vicious and by being more generously supplied with Russian weapons. There's a possibility then, in the 70s, that the PLO will take over Lebanon, which means that if the PLO takes over Lebanon will be run by the Sunnis. Okay, does that make sense? At this point, Syria gets scared and invades Lebanon. Why would Syria, none of us understood this. Why would Syria invade Lebanon? Assad doesn't want Lebanon to become a Sunni state, because they'll help the Muslim Brotherhood against him. Who knew? Okay? Assad hates Arafat and the PLO. Why? Arafat wants a Palestinian state. There's no Palestine to Assad. It's all Syria. Syria and Palestine used to be one big country under the Turks. There's no Palestine. You should be a Syrian patriot, not a Palestinian patriot. Okay? And so he wants that. Assad develops his own PLO to compete with Arafat. That's Ahmed Jibril. So they kill each other. Okay? Assad would love to annex Lebanon. Then he'll have something to show for his power. The cautious Assad, because that's what he had to be, works out a deal with Israel. under Rabin. You let me invade Lebanon, crush the Palestinian militias. I won't go south of the Litani River. I won't go near Israel, what they call the Red Line. And right or wrong, for better or worse, Rabin agreed. Rabin in Paris, before Begin came into power. And so there you have the new situation. So now the kleptocratic and ruthless Syrian army and intelligence service in Mukhabarat are controlling life in Lebanon. So let's just chazer over for a second. You got your Sunnis, you got your Shiites, you got your Druze, you got your Maronites. Now you got the PLO and you got the Syrians. Chad Gadol. It's all right? But it's a joke if you're sitting in Baltimore. It's not a joke if you live there. Now again, who cares? Is this next door to Israel? Can Israel avoid being dragged into this business? For the Maronites, things are not looking good. The objective realities are going to lead them, the Christians, to start thinking the unthinkable. And what is the unthinkable? Maybe we should ally with Israel. But is this good for Israel? Is this in Israel's self-interest? It's in the Maronite interest, in Israel's self-interest. That's enough for tonight.